When I first moved into the neighborhood, I thought I had finally found the peaceful corner of life I'd always dreamed about. The street was lined with well-kept homes, each with a neatly trimmed lawn and a few flower beds brightening the edges. It looked like the sort of place where neighbors waved to each other in the morning, children rode bikes in the evening, and weekends were filled with backyard barbecues. The house I bought sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, with a yard larger than most. For me, that backyard was the real selling point. I imagined building a garden, setting up a hammock, maybe even adding a small fire pit where friends could gather. The only thing missing was a fence. Without it, the open space felt exposed, and I had a dog who needed a safe place to roam. So, after moving in, I decided the first project would be to install a simple wooden privacy fence along the property line. It seemed like a reasonable improvement. Nothing fancy, just sturdy panels stained a natural color, blending into the trees at the edge of the lot. I wanted something that marked my boundaries but didn't scream for attention. The contractors I hired worked quickly, and within a week, the fence was complete. I stood back one evening, proud of how it turned out. My dog raced along the inside of the yard, tail wagging, free to run without a leash. Everything seemed perfect. That's when Karen entered the picture. Karen lived in the house directly behind mine. I hadn't met her yet, though I'd seen her peering through her blinds while the contractors worked. At first, I thought it was just curiosity. New fences draw attention in any neighborhood, and people are always a little nosy. But the day after the fence went up, she marched into my yard without knocking, without introducing herself, and stood there as if she owned the place. From the very first moment, she made it clear she didn't approve of the fence. She claimed it blocked her view of the street, that it ruined the aesthetic of the neighborhood, and that I should take it down. I calmly explained it was well within my property lines, professionally installed, and perfectly legal. She didn't like that answer. Her face tightened, her voice rose, and she stormed off, muttering something about not letting this slide. At first, I brushed it off. Everyone has a neighbor like that, the type who thrives on conflict, who looks for reasons to complain. I figured she'd vent, maybe gossip to a few other homeowners, and eventually move on. But I underestimated how far Karen was willing to go. Over the next few days, small signs of hostility started to appear. I noticed her standing at the fence line with a measuring tape, scribbling in a notebook. A couple of times, I saw her taking photos, angling her phone up and down as if she were gathering evidence for some grand case. She never waved, never smiled, just scowled and marched back inside. Then came the letters. One evening, tucked under my front door, I found an envelope addressed simply, Neighbor. Inside was a printed sheet filled with accusations. According to Karen, my fence was an eyesore, a violation of community standards, and a hazard to children. She demanded I remove it immediately or face serious consequences. I laughed at first. The neighborhood didn't even have an HOA, so there were no community standards she could enforce. The fence was built entirely on my land, following every local code. Her letter carried no weight, just the ramblings of a frustrated busybody. I tossed it in the trash and went about my evening. But Karen wasn't done. A week later, I was jolted awake early on a Saturday morning by loud knocks at the door. When I opened it, 2 police officers stood on my porch. Behind them, at a distance, was Karen, arms crossed, lips curled into a satisfied smirk. She had actually called the cops on my fence. The officers explained they'd received a complaint claiming I had built an illegal structure. They were polite, even apologetic, but they had to check it out. I walked them around the yard, showed them the permits, the property survey, and the receipts from the contractor. The officers inspected everything, nodded, and told me it all seemed perfectly legitimate. They left without taking any action. Karen's smirk faded when she realized her plan hadn't worked. But instead of backing off, she doubled down. That's when I realized this wasn't just about a fence. This was about control. Karen couldn't stand that someone new had come into the neighborhood and made a change she didn't approve of. She wanted to assert power, to scare me into submission. And if the police wouldn't do it for her, I had no doubt she'd find another angle. Over the next few weeks, her behavior escalated. I caught her tossing small bits of trash over the fence, leaving them scattered in my yard. She stood outside on her deck, yelling passive-aggressive comments loud enough for me to hear while I gardened. Sometimes, she even leaned over the fence, snapping more pictures like some self-appointed inspector. I documented everything. Every time she trespassed, every piece of trash, every strange action. I wrote it down and took my own photos. Something told me I'd need a record of her behavior. And sure enough, I was right. Because one morning, as I left for work, I saw a bright orange notice taped to my fence. It wasn't from the city, and it wasn't official. It was another letter from Karen, this time claiming she had filed a lawsuit against me. Whether it was true or not, I didn't know. But what I did know was that Karen wasn't going to stop. She had declared war over this fence, and she was willing to drag it as far as she could. What she didn't realize was that I was more prepared than she ever expected. The orange notice taped to my fence fluttered in the morning breeze, taunting me as I stood in the driveway. It was another one of Karen's theatrics, bold, dramatic, designed to scare me into tearing down the fence she despised so much. The paper claimed I was being sued for obstructing neighborhood harmony and damaging property values. No court stamp, no lawyer's signature, just Karen's name, scribbled in large letters at the bottom like she thought her word alone carried the weight of law. I knew immediately it was fake, but I also knew that this stunt wasn't the end. If she was willing to fabricate a lawsuit notice, she would eventually try something more official. I pulled the paper down, folded it, and slipped it into a folder where I'd been collecting evidence of her antics. The folder was getting thicker by the week. By now, Karen's obsession with my fence had spilled into nearly every corner of my daily life. She seemed to have endless energy for confrontation. If I watered my garden, she found a reason to yell about the hose spraying too close to her property line. If my dog barked in the yard, she threatened to call animal control. If I had friends over, she stood at her window, glaring at us as if a social gathering was a crime. But the worst was when she started spreading rumors. One evening, a neighbor down the street stopped me as I was walking my dog. She hesitated before speaking, clearly uncomfortable, then told me Karen had been going door to door, warning people about me. According to her, I was a troublemaker, someone who moved here to cause chaos, and ignored community values. She even told people I'd built the fence illegally, despite the police already confirming it was fine. It stung. I had moved into this neighborhood hoping for peace, maybe even friendship with those around me. Instead, I was being painted as the villain. And while most neighbors seemed polite enough, I could feel the shift in their behavior. Some avoided eye contact. Others were cool in conversation. Karen's poison was seeping into the community. Still, I tried to keep my cool. I reminded myself that facts mattered, not rumors. The fence was legal. My property was in order. And I had evidence on my side. The real question was, how far would Karen go before the situation boiled over? The answer came sooner than I expected. One night, close to midnight, I was woken by the sound of banging against the fence. At first, I thought it was the wind, but when I peered out my window, I saw a shadow moving along the panels. My heart raced. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside cautiously. The beam of light swept across the yard and landed on Karen, standing there with a hammer in her hand, pounding on one of the fence boards as if she could knock it loose. For a moment, we locked eyes. She didn't look guilty. She didn't even flinch. Instead, she shouted something about fixing what should never have been built before storming back toward her property. I couldn't believe it. This wasn't passive aggression anymore. This was direct vandalism. I called the police immediately. By the time they arrived, she was back inside her house, pretending nothing had happened. The officers knocked on her door, spoke to her briefly, and then came back to tell me they couldn't do much without visible damage. The fence was still standing, after all. I wanted to scream. She had been caught red-handed, but because she hadn't actually broken the fence yet, there was no real consequence. It felt like she was untouchable. But that's when I had an idea. If Karen was going to keep pushing the line, I needed to draw one myself. I invested in a set of security cameras, high definition, motion sensitive, with night vision. I placed them carefully along the fence and around my yard, angled to catch every corner. If Karen tried anything again, I'd have undeniable proof. And as if on cue, she did. Just a few nights later, the cameras recorded her tossing bags of trash over the fence. Empty soda cans, fast food wrappers, even a half-eaten sandwich. She did it casually, as if it were a chore she'd added to her daily routine. Then, on another night, She walked up to the fence with a spray bottle and misted something along the wood. I later discovered it was a mix of vinegar and salt, a trick meant to kill plants. She was trying to ruin the flowers I'd planted near the fence line. This time, I had everything on video. I debated what to do with the footage. Part of me wanted to confront her directly, to shove the evidence in her face and watch her crumble. But another part of me realized that wouldn't stop her. If anything, it might make her escalate further. No, I needed to be smarter. So I waited. I kept recording. Each time she trespassed, vandalized, or harassed, the cameras caught it all. The folder of evidence grew from a stack of papers into a full binder with screenshots, timestamps, and video clips. And while Karen thought she was making my life miserable, what she didn't realize was that she was building the very case that would destroy her campaign against me. The turning point came one afternoon when I received an official letter, not one of Karen's fake notices, but a real one from the city. Someone had filed a complaint against me, claiming my fence was built beyond property lines and encroached on a neighbor's land. The city had scheduled an inspection. And this was only the beginning. It didn't take a genius to know who filed it. I felt a wave of frustration, but also determination. This was Karen's big move, the one she thought would finally bring me down. But thanks to my records, my permits, and now the videos of her harassment, I was more prepared than ever. The inspection would decide the next chapter in this feud, and Karen was about to find out that she had picked a fight she couldn't win. The morning of the inspection arrived with a strange heaviness in the air. Clouds hung low, gray and swollen, as if the sky itself knew a storm was about to break loose in the neighborhood. I stood in my driveway, waiting for the city official to arrive, while Karen lingered in her yard like a hawk circling prey. She had dressed for the occasion, clipboard in hand, lips curled in smug anticipation, and eyes locked on me with a look that said she thought this was the day she would win. When the inspector pulled up, she wasted no time rushing forward to greet him. From where I stood, I could hear her loud, exaggerated voice explaining how I had built a massive illegal structure that destroyed the character of the neighborhood. She gestured wildly at the fence, pointing as though she were presenting evidence in a courtroom. The inspector nodded politely, jotting notes, though I could see from his expression that he wasn't entirely convinced. I waited calmly until it was my turn. Then I led him to my porch, where I had a neat stack of documents ready, the permit I'd filed, the property survey marking the exact boundaries, and the receipts from the license contractor. Each page was dated, signed, and perfectly in order. The inspector studied them carefully, occasionally glancing at the fence and measuring with his tools. Karen hovered nearby, muttering under her breath, trying to insert herself into the process. She paced the property line like a lawyer waiting for a loophole, interrupting with claims that the measurements were wrong, or the survey was outdated. The inspector finally told her to stand back, his patience thinning. As the inspection continued, I felt my confidence grow. Every measurement aligned perfectly with the survey. Every regulation had been followed to the letter. The fence stood exactly where it should, no more and no less. Meanwhile, Karen's face shifted from smug satisfaction to barely contained frustration. She had expected the inspector to side with her instantly, to order me to tear down the fence on the spot. But that wasn't happening. Still, she wouldn't give up. She brought out her own printed evidence, a collection of blurry photos she had taken from odd angles, claiming they proved the fence leaned into her property. The inspector examined them briefly, then set them aside. Compared to the official survey and the clear measurements, her photos carried no weight. When the inspection ended, the inspector closed his notebook and gave me a firm nod. He said the fence was in full compliance. There was no violation. No issue. Case closed. Karen exploded. She demanded he recheck the measurements, accused him of bias, even claimed I must have bribed the city. The inspector, clearly done with her theatrics, reminded her that making false complaints could itself become a problem. With that, he got into his vehicle and left, leaving Karen standing in the street, red-faced and fuming. For me, the relief was overwhelming. I had expected her complaint to be a hassle, maybe even drag into weeks of bureaucratic headaches. Instead, it was resolved in a single day. But more importantly, it revealed just how desperate Karen had become. She had fired her biggest shot, and it had backfired spectacularly. I thought, for a brief moment, that this would be the end of it. Surely, after such a public failure, she would retreat. But I should have known better. Karen wasn't someone who learned from defeat. She was someone who doubled down. Over the next week, her behavior grew even more erratic. She stood outside on her deck for hours, glaring across the fence as if her stare alone could tear it down. She blasted music at odd hours, songs with lyrics about freedom and community that she clearly thought were some kind of statement. And once again, the trash tossing began, this time with more frequency, as though she wanted to send me daily reminders of her contempt. But here's the thing. Every time she acted out, the cameras caught it. Every piece of trash, every trespass, every petty act of vandalism was recorded in crystal clear detail. I uploaded each clip, carefully dated and organized, into a secure folder. Piece by piece, Karen was building a case against herself without even realizing it. And then came the night that changed everything. It was late, past midnight, when the cameras picked up movement along the side of the fence. Karen, once again, was out there with her hammer. But this time, she didn't just tap against the boards. She pried at the panels, pulling and tugging until one of them cracked and splintered. She kept working, breaking a section of the fence until a jagged hole gaped wide enough for her to step through. She actually entered my yard. The footage showed her wandering around, muttering angrily to herself, before finally returning through the hole she'd made. When I saw the video the next morning, my blood ran cold. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was criminal. I called the police again, and this time, I had more than enough evidence. The officers came, watched the footage, and shook their heads in disbelief. They promised to file a report, and one of them mentioned that charges for trespassing and property damage were possible. For the first time, it felt like Karen might actually face real consequences. But I didn't stop there. I called my insurance company, filed a claim for the damage, and handed over the police report as evidence. They assured me the repairs would be covered, and that they would pursue Karen directly for reimbursement. Suddenly, her little midnight stunt had real financial stakes. And as I patched up the broken section of the fence, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of satisfaction and anticipation. Karen had gone too far, and now the system itself was starting to work against her. What she didn't know was that I had one more plan in motion, a way to turn all her months of harassment into the ultimate backfire. And when the time came, she would regret ever calling the cops on my fence. After months of enduring Karen's games, I finally had the leverage I needed. The footage of her breaking my fence was more than just proof of harassment. It was the kind of undeniable evidence that no rumor, no fake letter, no dramatic complaint could erase. I replayed the video multiple times, each time feeling the same rush of vindication. The sight of her creeping along the fence line, hammer in hand, was damning. And the best part was that she didn't seem to realize just how much trouble she was in. The police report had been filed. The insurance company was pursuing damages. But I knew if I wanted this war to end, I couldn't just rely on official channels. Karen had built her campaign on manipulating perceptions, whispering to neighbors, painting me as the villain, pretending to be the defender of neighborhood harmony. If I wanted to shut her down completely, I had to expose her for what she truly was. So I started planning. The first step was reaching out to a few neighbors. Not with gossip, not with rumors, but with facts. I invited them over one evening, offered them coffee, and showed them the footage. At first, they were hesitant, unsure if they wanted to get involved in the feud. But when they saw Karen tearing into my fence, stepping through into my yard in the dead of night, their jaws dropped. One neighbor admitted they had always suspected Karen was exaggerating, but they hadn't realized how far she was willing to go. Another shook their head, muttering that she had pulled similar stunts years ago with a different family who had since moved away. Piece by piece, the image Karen had worked so hard to create began to crack. Word spread quickly. Unlike her rumors, which were vague and twisted, my evidence was clear, time-stamped, and impossible to deny. The next time I walked my dog, instead of cold stares or awkward silence, I received nods of sympathy. A couple of people even apologized for believing her stories. Karen must have noticed the shift because her behavior changed too. She doubled down on her public performance, standing on her porch loudly proclaiming that I was harassing her, that I was manipulating the neighborhood against her. She waved around her clipboard, shouting about her evidence. But this time, her words fell flat. People had seen the truth. Still, I wasn't finished. The second step was to press forward with the legal side. I gathered every letter she had left on my door, every photo of the trash she'd thrown, every timestamp from the security footage. I built a binder, so thick it could barely close. Then I contacted a lawyer. When I laid out the evidence, the lawyer's reaction was immediate. He told me I had a strong case for harassment, trespassing, and property damage. He explained how, if I wanted, I could pursue both criminal charges and a civil lawsuit. Hearing those words felt like the first deep breath of relief I'd taken since moving into the neighborhood. While the legal wheels began turning, something unexpected happened. The homeowners, who had once avoided me, started reaching out with their own stories about Karen. One neighbor admitted she had harassed them about their holiday decorations. Another confessed that Karen once reported their teenage son for loitering when he was just waiting for a ride. It was as if my battle with her had opened the floodgates of resentment that others had bottled up for years. Karen was no longer the self-appointed enforcer of the neighborhood. She was the common enemy. But Karen, true to form, refused to back down quietly. One evening, I found yet another letter taped to my door. This one was a ranting, handwritten tirade accusing me of turning the community against her and threatening to take everything I owned. Her handwriting was shaky, the words underlined in fury. I slipped it into the binder with the rest of the evidence, realizing she had just handed me more proof of her instability. The real breaking point came when the police followed up on the trespassing report. They returned to my house with an update. Karen had been formally charged. The footage of her with the hammer was enough to push the case forward. For the first time, she was facing actual legal consequences. When the news spread, the neighborhood's patience with her finally snapped. A petition circulated quietly, signed by dozens of homeowners, demanding that Karen cease her harassment of neighbors. Some even filed their own complaints, emboldened by the fact that someone had finally stood up to her. I could see the change in her eyes whenever she spotted me outside. The smug confidence was gone, replaced by a mix of anger and desperation. She had built her identity on control, on intimidation, and now it was slipping through her fingers. But I wasn't celebrating yet. I knew Karen too well by now. Cornered animals lash out, and she was exactly the type to try one last, reckless move. The lawsuit was in motion, the charges were pending, and the neighborhood had turned against her. Everything was aligning. But until it was over, until Karen was forced to face the full consequences of her actions, I couldn't let my guard down. And sure enough, just when I thought I had seen the worst of her behavior, she proved me wrong again. Because the next chapter of this saga wasn't about petty letters or trash over the fence. It was about Karen crossing a line that would finally seal her fate, a line so clear that even she couldn't talk her way out of it. 4 months, Karen's campaign against me had been built on pettiness and manipulation. She thrived on small victories, the letters, the rumors, the dramatic confrontations. But after the charges were filed, something shifted in her. It was no longer about winning. It was about revenge. And when revenge drives someone like Karen, they don't stop to think about consequences. It started with the small escalations. She began leaving her floodlights on all night, pointed directly at my bedroom windows, as if she thought sleep deprivation would force me to cave. She parked her car deliberately across from my driveway, waiting in it for hours, staring at my house like some kind of neighborhood warden. She even started blasting a whistle whenever I stepped outside, shrill and piercing, as though she were signaling to the entire block that I had committed some crime. I ignored her as best I could. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every bizarre antic. The binder grew thicker with each passing week. My lawyer assured me that all of this only strengthened my case. But Karen wasn't satisfied with psychological games anymore. One night, just after midnight, the cameras picked up movement again. This time, it wasn't just Karen. She had dragged 2 large garbage bags into my yard, tearing them open along the fence line. Rotten food, old diapers, broken glass. She dumped the contents deliberately, spreading the mess across my grass before scurrying back into the shadows. When I saw the footage the next morning, I felt both disgusted and strangely relieved. Disgusted because of the sheer filth she had thrown onto my property, but relieved because this was the kind of clear, malicious act that left no room for excuses. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was deliberate vandalism, and it was all on video. I filed another police report, sent the footage to my lawyer, and began cleaning up the mess. But as I scooped up the rotting garbage, I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't finished. This wasn't her final act. This was a build-up to something bigger. And I was right. A week later, I came home from work to find something far worse than trash. Spray painted across my fence in large, uneven letters were the words, "Illegal scum." The paint dripped down the wood, stark red against the natural stain, impossible to miss. I froze in my driveway, staring at the vandalism. It was the kind of act you couldn't hide, couldn't spin, couldn't pretend didn't happen. Every car that drove past, every neighbor who stepped outside, could see what Karen had done. Once again, the cameras had caught everything. The footage showed her creeping out just before dawn, can of spray paint in hand, scrawling the words furiously across the panels before retreating into her house. There was no denying it. This was the moment I had been waiting for. I contacted the police immediately, and this time, the response was different. They didn't just take a report. They came to my house, watched the footage, and then marched straight to Karen's door. I watched from my porch as they knocked, listened to the muffled argument, and then saw them escort her out. She wasn't handcuffed, but the sight of her being led away, her face twisted in outrage, was a turning point. The neighborhood saw it too. People emerged from their homes, whispering to each other, shaking their heads. Karen had always painted herself as the moral compass of the community, the one who kept everyone in line. Now, she was the one being pulled aside by the police, exposed for the vandal she truly was. In the days that followed, the fallout was swift. The petition against her gained traction. Neighbors who had once tolerated her behavior now openly condemned it. She became isolated, her phone calls ignored, her presence unwelcome at community gatherings. The very power she had wielded over the neighborhood dissolved almost overnight. But the legal side was where the real blow landed. With the combined evidence of trespassing, vandalism, harassment, and now destruction of property, my lawyer pushed forward with the case. Karen was facing not only criminal charges, but also a civil lawsuit. The damages she owed, for repairs, for cleanup, for emotional distress, were climbing into the thousands. I patched the spray-painted fence, but I didn't erase it completely. For several days, I left the faint outline of the words visible, a reminder to anyone who walked by of what Karen had done. It wasn't about shame. It was about truth. And Karen hated it. She screamed at me from her porch, demanding I stop spreading lies. She threatened more lawsuits, more complaints, more retaliation. But her words no longer carried the same weight. Nobody listened. Nobody cared. She had crossed the line, and now the consequences were unavoidable. Still, I knew there was one more chapter left in this war. Because while Karen had already destroyed her reputation and was staring down serious charges, the final blow was yet to come. The courtroom showdown where everything she had done would be laid bare, and where she would finally be forced to face the full cost of her obsession. And I was ready for it. The day of the hearing felt surreal. After months of tension, sleepless nights, and endless harassment, everything had led to this. The courthouse stood tall and indifferent, its cold stone exterior hiding the human drama about to unfold inside. I walked through the doors carrying the binder that had become my shield, filled with letters, photos, timestamps, and most importantly, the security footage that told the story better than words ever could. Karen was already there. She sat in the hallway, arms folded, lips pursed, her eyes darting between me and the lawyer at my side. Gone was the smug confidence she once paraded through the neighborhood. She looked worn, her posture defensive, her expressions erratic. Yet even then, she tried to summon the old fire. She muttered about conspiracies, about how I had tricked everyone, about how the system was biased against her. But none of that mattered anymore. The evidence was too strong. When the hearing began, my lawyer laid everything out in precise order. He spoke calmly, presenting each piece of documentation like a stone in a wall, building an unshakable case. First, the permits and survey proving the fence was fully legal. Then, the letters Karen had written, dripping with hostility. After that, the photos of trash tossed over the fence, the damage to my plants, and finally the crown jewel, the videos. The footage played on a large screen, the room silent except for the sound of Karen's own actions. There she was, creeping across my yard at midnight with a hammer. There she was, dumping garbage. There she was, spray painting illegal scum in sloppy red letters. Each clip was time-stamped, clear, undeniable. Karen fidgeted in her seat, muttering to herself, shaking her head violently, as though denial could change what everyone's eyes were seeing. When it was her turn to speak, she launched into the same routine I'd seen for months. She claimed I had provoked her, that I was harassing her with cameras, that the entire neighborhood was conspiring against her. Her words tumbled out in a frenzy, uncoordinated and desperate. The judge listened patiently but unimpressed. Her explanations crumbled under the weight of the evidence. Each excuse was met with a counterpoint, each accusation with hard proof to the contrary. What Karen thought was a defense only deepened the impression that she was unstable and malicious. When the ruling finally came, it was everything I had hoped for. The judge declared the fence legal and compliant, dismissing every one of Karen's complaints. She was found guilty of vandalism, trespassing, and harassment. She was ordered to pay for the repairs, cover my legal fees, and compensate me for damages. The total sum was staggering, enough to sting badly for someone who had wasted so much time and energy on petty warfare. But the punishment didn't end with money. A restraining order was placed against her, forbidding her from coming near my property or contacting me in any form. The judge's words were firm: one more incident, and Karen would face jail time. As the gavel fell, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Months of stress, anger, and frustration melted into a single moment of relief. I had won, not through retaliation, not through stooping to her level, but through patience, evidence, and persistence. Karen, on the other hand, looked shattered. Her face was pale, her hands shook, and for once, she had nothing to say. The neighbors who had come to observe, the same ones she once tried to recruit into her crusade, shook their heads as they watched her storm out of the courtroom defeated. When I returned home, the neighborhood felt different. People waved again. Some stopped by to congratulate me, others to apologize for not seeing through Karen sooner. The fence, once the symbol of conflict, had become the marker of victory. My dog ran along it joyfully, as if sensing the shift in energy. Over the following weeks, Karen became a ghost. She stopped standing on her porch. She no longer prowled the fence line. The floodlights went dark. For a time, her house sat quiet, blinds drawn, silence replacing the chaos she had thrived on. Eventually, I heard whispers that she was preparing to move, unable to face the neighbors she had alienated, unwilling to live in a community where her power had evaporated. And when the day finally came that a moving truck pulled into her driveway, I watched from my porch, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with a calm sense of closure. She had tried to ruin my life over a fence. In the end, she had only ruined her own. As the truck pulled away and her house stood empty, I glanced at the fence one last time. Strong, solid, untouched. It had withstood everything she threw at it, just as I had. The war was over, and Karen would forever regret the day she called the cops on my fence.